do. Thanks. Thank you very much. Well, good morning again. It's encouraging that so many of you have come to my second talk. This is always a good sign. I hope you're enjoying yourself as much as I am. It's really great to be participating in this event, and I'd like to thank Woody and all the organisers for making it so efficient and making me feel so welcome. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Right, okay. So yesterday I talked about a small genus which is very suitable for pot culture, and today I'm going to talk about bigger plants, which many are still very suitable for pot culture. They're not all trees. There are lots of columnars which are actually quite small. So I could flower lots of them in my glass house in England. But you here, of course, have got a chance of growing many of them outside. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the environments they grow in, and that might give you a clue as to which ones would be suitable for growing where you live. So you already know, of course, that Peru is on the west coast of South America. It's the third largest country. I can't compete with Marlon's homeland. That, of course, is the largest. Argentina is second, and Peru is the third. And here's an image that shows you the size of Peru in relation to the United States, to give you an idea that it's quite a big place. So it takes quite a bit of getting around, and the roads aren't as good as yours, so it can take you quite a while to get from one place to another. Lots of people come to Peru. Let's have a show of hands of how many people have been to Peru. Oh, well, there you are then. I must say, when I ask people in England that question, I only get a very few. So it's good to hear that so many of you have been to this wonderful country. So I guess you might have gone to look at the cacti, but you've also most probably gone to see Machu Picchu, which is one of those places that really you ought to try and see. A lot of people go to Lake Titicaca on the left here, and many people go to the city I showed you yesterday, Huaraz, which is great for trekking. Now, we heard from Marlon about the cacti of this area here. These are areas of a number of genera present in different parts of South America. So one of the hotspots is eastern Brazil here, and Peru does pretty well in the Andean part of the country here. If you then move on and look at columnar cacti, you'll see again that Peru has many of them. And it's generally believed that the evolution of cacti started in Peru and then radiated out across South America and ultimately into North America. And there's interesting plants in Peru that perhaps give you a clue as to what cacti looked like a long time ago. There are currently recognized 21 genera of columnar cacti in South America. The ones with the little asterisks are those that are endemic. The reason that there aren't more is that the northern Peru is very like southern Ecuador. So quite a few of the plants which are mainly centered on Peru extend up into Ecuador. And similarly in the south, the northern Chile is similar to southern Peru. So you get quite a few that go over that border as well. It's quite interesting that there are some plants that just fit rather nicely into the country of Peru. They seem to be rather shy about going over the border. They get within 10 kilometres and then say, well, I'm not going. Well, you know, the paperwork on the borders in southern Peru. So, who went to look? Well, Peru's been a place where lots and lots of explorers, of course, have gone. And I'd just like to mention a few of the major contributors to the plants that I'm going to show you later. So it all really started at the end of the 18th century when Humboldt and Bonpland, I'm sure you all know Humboldt, he's had plants named after him, currants named after him, all sorts of things. And he travelled in northern Peru and discovered quite a few plants which we know today, including Esposto lanata, for instance. Although, of course, at the time that he did his travels, the only genus available to him, of course, was Cereus. So it was up to later workers to come up with these new generic names. Weberbauer is also commemorated in a number of cacti, Weberbauer cereus and Machicana webebauri. He was also German. Did I mention the other day how much work the Germans had done in South America? Well, you know, they seem to like the place. They've been there a lot. So he found, and a lot of them are still there, I might say as well. He did travels in the early part of the 20th century, and then Vaupel described lots and lots of plants. And I have to hand it to these guys. They listed these plants, described them, and even today nearly all their species are recognised. So they were looking for really different plants. Weberbauer must have gone past lots of plants that he didn't describe. And the only thing I can think is that he only described plants when he could see the flowers and the fruits. If the plant was out of flower or out of fruit, he seemed to just sort of think, well, I'll do that one later. And therefore he left a few for us to find, which is great. Now, they must be your heroes. They certainly are amongst mine. Britton and Rose, they created quite a few of the genera that we accept today. Genera like Browningia, Columnar Cactus, Esposta and Neramondia are all genera erected by Britton and Rose in their wonderful 4-part book, which is well worth looking at. It looks sort of daunting, but you know, it's quite a good read actually, and it's in English, which is really a big advantage to me. Backerberg's work is almost all in German. He was a prolific author, and he had a nursery, and he did visit South America on a number of occasions and went to Peru often, and then he sold the seeds and plants that he got through various seed catalogues, and there's a couple of the examples from the 1930s. He was a tremendous cataloguer of plants, and in his 6-volume book, it's probably the most sort of comprehensive description of the whole of the Cactaceae in recent years. It was his work that the New Cactus Lexicon endeavoured to bring up to date. Frederick Ritter, I think he has to be my top hero for hunting for cacti in South America. That's quite an unusual picture of him in his garden when he lived in Chile. But he took years and years and years before he wrote his books, and he didn't do that till the 1980s. And in those, he described lots of wonderful plants that he'd found during his 6 visits to Peru. And we must mention Professor Dr. Werner Rau. Obviously, we know Rau from plants, Armatocereus, for instance. He was a professor at Heidelberg University, and he did the first book on the cacti of Peru in 1958, which was his doctorate thesis. He visited Peru twice before that, and then many times afterwards, because he was interested in all sorts of plants, bromeliads and so on. And his book is really the first one that you should read. It's in German, of course, but it tells you an awful lot about the country, and working with Backerberg, he described many new plants. So Peru consists of a series of parallel mountain ranges, the Andes, splitting up into a series of ridges that run north-south. It's Lima, the capital city, is more or less in the middle of this vast country here, and I refer to the area south of that as southern, and the area north of northern. That might seem very simple, but since I say it so often, I thought I ought to say what I mean. It breaks into many vegetation zones, but a simplified approach to this would be that you've got the left side, the side next to the Pacific, yellow in this map, which is the arid coastal strip. It's in a rain shadow, so it's very dry, and it, again, rarely rains, but does get quite a lot of mist. And the plants depend on this, the plants that are there depend on this mist, and that varies from place to place. And you get some places which are very favoured for mist, and these are called low mass, and they're good places to look for cacti. Then you get the coastal valleys, which get steadily less arid as you climb. Then the brown area is the higher parts of the Andes. Now, there's lots of plants there and lots of cacti, but there aren't many columnars. The columnars either are in the valleys on the west or in the valleys on the east. So I've split my talk into those two groups so that you can see which genera occur only on one side and which genera occur on both sides. So what do the coastal valleys look like? Well, they come up from the coastal plain. There's often a fairly flat starting part that you can easily get up, and then you end up going up really zigzag mountain roads to climb from sea level, eventually up as high as, let's say, 4,000 meters. That's about 14,000 feet. Now, these valleys are quite isolated, so what's happened is that you find plants in one that don't occur in the next one. They've been isolated for quite a long time, although the Andes are still rising, of course. So some species have managed to populate many of the valleys, almost all of them, and others are only found in one. So it's quite interesting. Now, this is Werner Rau's rather clever drawing, and it gives you an idea of the way that the plants change as you go up the valleys. So here's the coastal plain. He's showing us some cacti here, up to about 1,000 meters here. Well, in fact, cacti will go all the way up here, but when you get up to over 3,000 meters up here, you don't find big columnars. It's just not a suitable habitat. So the coastal plain is the place where the Pan-American Highway runs. This runs the length of Peru. It isn't dual carriageway all the way, but it is tarmacked all the way. And this is the principal arterial route of Peru. So if you want to get from north to south, the quickest way to do it is on the Pan-American Highway along the coast. I mentioned my good friend Paul Huxley yesterday, and you'll see that I credit quite a lot of his pictures. We've sort of worked on Peru together, and I've tended to do the north more, and he's tended to do the south more. So he's got recent digital pictures of the south. So I've used a lot of Paul's pictures, and I'm obviously very grateful to him for letting me do that. So this is a very useful road. It's very busy, but it does make getting from north to south very quick. But getting from east to west is another story. You've got to go over the mountains. There are a few tarmac roads, but not very many. If they've had any rain, then it can be completely impossible. So the valleys tend to be agriculture in the floors. Now this is through irrigation. The rivers are often completely dry, but at certain times of the year they do get a lot of water in them from snowmelt from the mountains and also from the rain that occurs in the mountains. And often they're dammed up, so they create lakes and then use that water for irrigating the flat valley bottoms. But those valley sides, like I'm standing on here, or like Paul was standing on here, is where the cacti tend to be found. You can see it's pretty arid. Pretty well all of our pictures tend to be taken in the southern spring, so most of these pictures will have been taken in October or November, even into December. So you do find a few cacti just growing in favoured spots in amongst this very sandy plain. But there aren't very many cacti that inhabit that area. Then as you climb up here, the Chilite Valley, more and more cacti appear. And they tend to appear at certain altitudes. So a particular species will be associated with a particular altitude. So it's to do with the amount of moisture they get. So it gets less and less arid as you go higher up. The plants often occur in multi-generic groups together between north and south. The species might vary slightly, but the genera tend to remain fairly constant. So the first things you tend to find are Neromondia, growing with Armatocereus and Espostoa. In the drier valleys, like this one, this is the Santa Valley, the plants don't necessarily get any water at all from year to year. It just depends. The years they get the most water is when there's an El Nino event. Now this is when the seawater off the coast of Peru, well, I'm probably telling you something you know something about, because the El Nino affects you as well, doesn't it? The El Nino effect to the cacti in Peru is absolutely vital. This slightly warming of the water offshore greatly increases the amount of rainfall that they get. And sometimes you get a flowering desert, but it doesn't happen very often. I think 7 to 10 years, although recently they've been more intense and they've been closer together. So when you get to about 600 or 700 meters, you can start to find what you might describe as cactus forests. And the main elements of these are usually Espostoa, Neromondia, and Armatocereus. And there are globular plants here as well, so you'll find Melocactus here, and sometimes you'll find Myla and other small growing plants. So Neromondia is the first one I'd like to talk about. I don't have my picture taken very often, although Marlon obviously did it without me knowing, I might say. But you get an idea at least that these Neromondias get pretty tall. Now there's a number of names. Arequipensis is the oldest name. In the centre of the country they're pink flowered and they get called rosiflorus. And in the north they're really, really big like this one, and they tend to be called gigantea. But I think it's all the same thing. And they occur by their tens of thousands. So when you find them, there's often a lot, and they go right up the hills in the most arid environments. And that's interesting, as was pointed out before, by the way that the areoles continue to flower for years and years and years. So here's examples of the areoles that are growing and flowering probably year after year. This stem may not have grown for decades. And they probably won't grow a new stem until an El Nino year. And when that happens, they grow new stems at a fantastic rate. Huge arms appear and grow within a year. But they don't start to flower until they've stopped growing, and then these areoles start to flower. It's a very nice pot plant, this is. It has lovely big areoles, and really it's quite popular even as a small seedling. I should mention its relative, the only other Neromondia, used to be in its own genus, and that's in Bolivia. And I've seen lots of what used to be near Cardinazia hertzoggiana growing around here. It seems to do very well. Now, Espostoa is quite a large genus and an important one. They all have these side cephalia. In the coastal valleys in the south, you find Espostoa melanostele. That is the coastal species. It occurs from south of Lima, right up as far as the Rio Sania Valley, where it's replaced by a form of lanata, which has been called procera in the past. Melanostele was put in its own genus, Pseudoespostoa, by Backerberg, because it's the only one with glossy seeds. All the others have matte seeds. But really, it's a minor difference, and today we tend to put them all in Espostoa. A close relative of melanostele, and perhaps a subspecies of it, is Espostoa nana. There was one sold in this very room last night, wasn't there? Well, this plant replaces melanostele in a few of the valleys in the north. And when we were there, we went up some valleys that I don't think anybody had ever been up from Europe, and we extended the distribution of this much further north than was ever thought before. It makes a very nice plant to grow because it only gets about half the size or less than melanostele, and certainly for us, it'll grow cephalium when it's much younger. So in the far north, it's replaced by a very tall plant. This plant grows to 25 feet, Espostoa procera, often considered to be part of the lanata species. And curiously, it's very prone to producing cristates. And if you look in Backerberg's books, you'll see that he amused himself by cutting quite a lot of these off and presumably selling them back in Germany for quite a lot of money. There's some fantastic pictures. You know, there's an existing video. Well, no, it wouldn't be a video, would it? It would be well, I saw it as a VHS film of Backerberg actually hacking pieces of plants off. So he actually filmed himself, and the film still exists, can you believe? Yeah, and he's got his pipe in his mouth, which he's carrying, while he's hacking at this plant. And the kit they wore as well, they must have been so hot, you know, he would look like he was dressed for dinner, this chap. Amazing. Anyway, so the other genus that's common on the coast is Armatocereus, and this is one of the few plants that you can actually find right on the very coast. I'll just take a drink, where it's very, very dry. So the commonest one is Pseudomelanostele, which is the familiar one that I'm sure many of you grow with the golden spines. Armatocereus don't have a cephalium. They're nocturnal flowering and usually white flowered, but there are a few populations that have red flowers. And when they grow near Espostoas, which they nearly always do, you can get the hybrid. And here's an example of the hybrid, and you can see the hybrid has picked up little flecks of cephalium from its Espostoa parent. This hybrid was called Neobuxbaumia by Backerberg. They're really pretty plants with their dense spination. It isn't always yellow, it can be white and sometimes black. The flowers, there's the nocturnal flowers, they stay open a little bit of time in the morning. And I guess that they're visited by a number of pollinators, but I guess that bats have probably got something to do with it. But on the very coast, where it's really, really dry, you can find a few species just living in what is basically a dry, sandy desert, living just on the moisture that drifts in off the very cold sea next door. You know, these are quite near the sea. So in the north, you've got repens and another one, I'll remember its name in a minute, tenuis. And then in the south, down here, you've got, this is Paul's picture, of australis. They don't look as if they're having too good a time of it, but there's plenty of them, and they flower and they fruit, so it's perhaps not so bad. Oh, there's tenuis. Tenuis on holiday on the beach. It's a holiday shot. These plants are not actually very big. They're no thicker than my thumb. This is a miniature, and it spreads all over the place. If you grow it in like a seed tray, it spreads all over, and it flowers with lovely nocturnal flowers regularly. Pretty little plant, very nice. Sometimes the spines are slightly plumose. They are dissected with little subspines, and this is an adaptation, presumably, to catch the mist. So Armatocereus are one of the few genera that you find in these sort of very arid, sandy places. It's not covered by this talk, but they often grow with these layers, which of course are the Neopateria Eriocyces that grow in the very south, but they often grow with these. There's the flower buds coming. Now, a genus I like very much, and I must say this is extremely closely related to Armatocereus. This is Loxanthocereus, and they often grow together, and they look remarkably alike, and it takes quite a long time to get your eye in to tell them apart. The fruits are very similar, seeds are similar, but these have day flowers, which are tubular, shaped much like the machicanas we were looking at yesterday, and classically thought to be hummingbird pollinated. But you know what I'm going to say next. I've never actually seen a hummingbird pollinated them, but there you go. I think they must do, but I've never been there at the right time, probably. They're sometimes put into Borsey cactus, but I think I'm inclined to leave them out like Joel did. I think they probably do. There is this DNA study, and I'm hoping that will help us to finally decide. But for this talk, I've left them out of Borsey cactus. And there are a number of species, and they all have glorious flowers. And they're very common. When you find them, there tends to be a lot of them. So this is Salsifer, one of the ones. This is the furthest north, I think, of all of them. And then in the south, you've got small, sprawling ones. So the two principal ones are Sextonianus and this one, Gracilis, which used to be your compatriot Akers described that as Maritimocerius. And then, remember I mentioned yesterday that my friend Paul Huxley, discovered a new one further south than any other, and when it eventually flowered, the flowers were completely different from any other Loxanthocereus. Fruits and seeds are similar, plants look similar, but the flower is like the flower of Labivia maximiliana. It's much smaller, tubular, this amazing bicolour flower. These plants flower, for me in England, at less than 2 years old from seed. It's a tiny plant, and it flowers and it flowers and it flowers all through the summer. So this is going to be a very nice pot plant to have, and it's going to be common in no time because the thing flowers from seed so young and produces fruit so easily that I can only think that it won't be long before anybody that wants one can have one. So that's the new one. It was on the front of Bradley, by the way, about 2 years ago when I described it for Paul. Oh, and thanks for the mention of Bradley, Jim. That's very kind of you. So, this is another very interesting one that you don't see in cultivation very often. It was originally distributed by Knizia as Senilioides, and then Ritter described it as Hoffmanni. He described it illegally. It wasn't a valid description, so I validated the description with a plant that I had in culture. It's only growing in one valley, just south of Lima. Hoffmanni is a hairy one, the only hairy Loxanthocereus that I'm aware of. As you see, it looks like an Espostoa and then produces a flower that you can only say is a Loxanthocereus flower. So that's a very nice plant. It's quite localized in this valley. There's a lot of plants there, but it's a small area. Now we go on to Armatocereus. Now, people at home in England know I always joke about plants that are as ugly as sin. Well, you know, Armatocereus, I think, is a contender for probably the least attractive cactus in Peru. And I have this phrase, best left in habitat, yeah? You know? So this is definitely best left in habitat. You might think differently because you can probably grow it in your garden. But then they're tatty plants, you know, they're not very pretty. But you see they're quite common. When you find them, you tend to find a lot. The commonest one on the coast is Laertus, the oldest name. And here it is. This is the type locality. This was one of the ones that Humboldt and Bonpland found all that time ago, back in the beginning of the 19th century. So Cereus laertus it was then, later to become Armatocereus. And you see this fruit. It's quite a clever fruit, this is. It's really, really spiny until it's ripe. And then when it's ripe, it falls off whole and sheds all its spines. Okay, now that's they're cleverer than they look, these plants, you know. That presumably is an adaptation so that some animal then can actually eat the fruit and cart off the seeds and move it around. If you left your armour of spines all the way around, it would make it unpalatable, wouldn't it? So they shed their spines when they're ripe. So they often grow with Neromondia in the valleys, and it's very widespread, right from near the border with Ecuador all the way down to near the border with Chile. But it is endemic, it never goes outside the country. This is it's not endemic. This species also occurs in Ecuador. This is Cartwrightianus. This is the one that occurs on the coast. This has been greatly impacted by banana plantations because the flat coastal plain in southern Ecuador is used as a huge production of bananas. And this plant also grows there, but it's still there because it's on all the rocky outcrops. But it's not very nice. And the flower is nothing to get excited about, is it? Bats like them. Now, the other one that's common in the coastal valleys between Lima, around Lima, and north, up about as far as the Cordillera Negra, is Armatocereus procerus, which makes huge forests. And it's quite a fastigiate plant, you know, it has very upright branches, and it's one you don't very often see in culture. So I don't know whether this would be any prettier or any easier to grow, but Paul managed to catch one in flower. But you can see they're very common. And as was mentioned with some other plants earlier, they when you look at them in a group like that, they follow the places where the water will have run off the hill on the few occasions when it rains. Now there's one. You could think I'm cheating here. Is this a columnar cactus? Well, I'm going to put it in as an honorary columnar, even though it probably hardly ever exceeds a few inches tall. Pygmaeocereus. Now, in the south, there's one species supposedly, although there are more. They look very different, and I suspect maybe that's overlumped. They make these little sort of patterns in the ground. They've got big tuberous roots. They have big, long-tubed, small but long-tubed, very sweet-smelling flowers at night, which I assume are pollinated by moths. It's something for the succulent. Yeah, I think this is a Clistanthe, is that right? I don't know. That's the one in the south. Now, years and years later, there was a description of a plant called Pygmaeocereus bibli, which was said to come from 100 kilometres north of Huaraz. Now, Ted Anderson went to look for it and he didn't find it. And nobody found it. And the reason they didn't find it is that unlike this one, which grows on the coast, Bibli grows on the top of a mountain, 600 kilometers away from this one. And there it is, it's flat to the ground, a beautiful little plant, I think possibly one of the prettiest of the plants from Peru. Now, this was only found recently by chance. The road that goes to Siwas from the coast was destroyed by an earthquake that brought a mountain down and completely buried the road. And they just decided that putting another road there was a really bad idea because it'll happen again. So they put it over a completely different mountain. And what was it growing on that mountain? This. So this has got a main road next to it now, but only in the last few years. And since then, of course, everybody's been able to go and see it. So it grows high up. And then down in the valley below, people had driven past these places for years. It was so dry, they thought there's nothing can grow here. But here you find the Kuhasi form of it. This is 1,000 meters lower down, and these plants can grow up to 10 inches tall. So we'd been driving past these for years, and I stopped on this occasion, and those of you near enough can actually see there's plants in this picture, but you know, they look so much like the rocks, if you're driving you'd never stop. Very arid environment. And they're very different in culture. These are much finer spined and much bigger growing. Oops, sorry. So, there's one Eulychnia that grows in Peru. There's lots, there's another 5 that come from Chile, but there's only one from Peru, and that's called Riteri. And it was only known from near the town of Camaná on the coast. And these are Paul's pictures of the few plants that are there. There's not many. But my intrepid friend Paul decided that there must be some somewhere else. So he looked on Google Earth and looked for tracks and looked for likely places. And a few kilometres north of here, about 30 kilometres north of here, he took a side road that went inland from the Pan Am. And he ended up finding a whole hillside covered with these plants, hundreds and hundreds of them. Not only were they bigger, but they were also a lot healthier and growing beautifully. So we know that now that this plant is actually much more common than we thought. It's a nice plant to grow. I find Eulychnias slow-growing plants. So as you go up the valleys, and you can see the humidity hanging in the air here. Look how humid this is. The sea's behind here. And this humid air is coming inland and precipitating around and providing moisture for the plants. So Weber-Bough-Cereus, named after Weber-Bough that we mentioned earlier, it's closely related to Cloister cactus, but it has bat-pollinated flowers rather than the tubular, supposedly hummingbird pollinated flowers of Cloister cactus. It's widespread, and there are the different species have different shaped flowers, but I think they're all bat pollinated. And they get really quite big. These plants can grow to 25 to 30 feet tall, some of them. The prettiest one is probably Winterianus or Johnstonianus, which is the lovely one with the golden spines. And when it flowers, it has a bristly crown, so that's nice. Rather sadly, it's often used as a grafting stock in Europe. I don't know what it is here, but it does make quite a good grafting stock, actually. So that's one of the nicest ones, and that's from the northern valleys. And then from the southern valleys, you get the plant called Rowie, and you can see from the chap standing on the right that the plant gets pretty big. This again can grow to 30 feet tall, named after Werner Rau, quite variable. Further south you get Weber-Bowery, which is similar, but rather coarser spined. Now, we haven't finished with Weber-Bough-Cereus, we haven't finished with Espostoa, but we've got to go to the other side of the Andes to see the others. So I'll show you those in a bit. Now, Oreocereus also occurs on both sides of the Andes. So here we are in southern Peru. The flowers of Leucotrichus, and these have big fruits, which the seeds dry out inside, and then they trickle out through a little hole in the bottom of the fruit. And Arequipa belongs to these, and even though the flowers of it are very like those of Matricana, they're not related. They're really distant. It's just that the convergence has produced very similar flowers. Now everybody's interested in Browningia candelaris. This was an old name, Mayan name from southern Peru, But it occurs over the whole of Peru, right from the south, right into Chile, and well up to the north as well, around Lima is the furthest north it occurs. When the plants are young, they're just a single spiky trunk. Eventually, when they mature, they produce a candelabra head of naked branches. It's tempting to think that these lived in a place where there were large animals that would have eaten the plants, but so they don't need spines above the height that the animal can graze. There were no giraffes here. We've seen about giraffes, well, nothing like that ever lived here, I don't think, but they certainly were large animals here, and I think that must be an adaptation to that. You see they eventually get rather large. They live in quite arid environments. They never occur in dense stands. They're usually just odd plants. Closely related is Browningia microsperma, also occurs in Ecuador. Not a very pretty plant, but quite nice as a seedling. And this also has bristly crown where it flowers. Here's Paul standing next to Browningia hetlingianus, which you may know as an Azureus cereus. It's the bluest of all the cereoids from Peru. And you can see that it's nocturnal flowering with these amazing black buds opening to these rather pretty white flowers. That picture was actually taken at night by Paul. This is a very nice plant to cultivate, and I have seen them growing here. Hardly ever seen in cultivation is Ritter's Browningia candelaris, Browningia columnaris. Now it grows very near Browningia hetlingianus. They're within sight of each other, but the big difference is that this grows on gypsum. Gypsum is extremely rare in South America, extremely rare. I only know of very few places where I've seen any gypsum. And on just a few gypsum outcrops, this plant occurs. I think we were the first people to see it since Ritter discovered it. It has smaller flowers than its sister species, but it's also very blue. In fact, as seedlings, it's even bluer. Now, Columnar cactus is another genus best left in habitat, probably. They become extremely scruffy. The one you hardly ever see is brachypetalus, but it's got a nice flower. The one that's got an even nicer flower is brevistylus, which is from higher altitude, but they're very scruffy, the plants are. There's more dead than alive, usually. But they're the two big ones. Now, we also include Erdisia in Columnar cactus, which are little plants, and they make quite nice pot plants. Now, I should talk about Borsi cactus. These come from the north and from Ecuador. And they've got generally tubular flowers. They normally get quite a good size. Here's Plagiostoma, and the plant in the middle, which I didn't caption, is Samnensis. These both come from San Pablo. They grow side by side, in fact. And the one I'm sure you've all grown is Icosagonus. I call this Icosagonus subspecies Humboldti, because this was another one of those discovered by Humboldt and Bonpland, and they gave the locality of Peru. The other forms of Icosagonus, which are very different, occur in Ecuador. There's an article in Bradley about that if you want to read it up. But this is a sprawling plant with nice orange flowers that grow from a very hairy zone at the top. Now we're going to go to the inland. This is the second sort of habitat type. Often the plants are very dense on this side. They get more rain on this side because the rainfall is coming up from the Amazon on the east side. So you get dense stands of cacti on this side. And another one of Rao's diagrams shows a typical valley. Now you'll see that the sides of these valleys are really high now. This is 5,000 meters, right? So that's 18,000 feet. So the cacti only, the columnar cacti anyway, only occur in the very bottoms. Higher up you find Opuntias and things like Arroyo. The Marañón Valley is the classic habitat for many cacti. Browningia comes from here, Browningia pylifer. The Marañón Valley is the most magical place. And I'm sure John Trader will be interested to see, it's the locality of Peperomia wolfgang-krani, which is on this year's ISI distribution. I have to say, in the wild, it's extremely common, this plant. You can hardly walk without standing on it, but what a pretty plant that is. I think I can see the attraction of succulents, but I'm trying to resist the dark side, you know. But there's no shortage of cactus. Dense forests consisting of Armatocereus balsacensis, yes, brown India pilifera, and also Espostoa mirabilis. The roads, I mentioned the roads yesterday. I always mention them because it's one of the things that I dream about. It's less dangerous than it looks, as long as you can't. By the way, there are some pictures here that I'd rather you didn't tell my wife about. Is that okay? She worries about me, you know, and I tell her only part of the story, to be absolutely honest. But so I'd like it to be a secret between us that I go on roads like this, okay? But you have to go down roads like this because the good stuff's at the end of roads like this. You know, it's not next to a freeway. You know, it's down there. So brown India pilifera, very widespread in the Marignan, has these naked naked tubes, and eventually followed by naked fruits. A weird plant, really. Very spiny when it's young and practically naked when it's older. Growing with it, Armatocereus rowi, the tallest of all the Armatocereus in my experience. This plant can grow to 30, 35 feet. Quite fastigious, quite upright, segmented stems, a nocturnal pink flower. More large Armatocereus. They're all sort of bigger here because they get more water. So these are big plants. An open flower, quite an open flower. Another bat flower, quite smelly really. The Armatocereus that hardly anybody ever grows is Cuscoensis, which by the way doesn't grow at Cusco. Right? I don't know why it was called that. Carol Kanitsa, who's famous for sending you plants you didn't order, he actually described this plant. All credit to him. It is a very good species. So there's some Borsig cactus on the east side, presumably bat-pollinated flowers. These used to be called Clisanthocereus. They make candelabra-shaped, very pretty plants. And there's quite a few of them. You see a nice shaped plant. Been a lot of confusion over the names. This one is Neo-Resley. Comes from the far north. And then I described this plant after your countryman, Paul Hutchison. Paul found this plant back in the 1960s. He illustrated it, a lovely picture in your journal, in colour, in 1965. And he said, one day I'm going to describe this. Well, he didn't. So when I went there and saw it and looked all that up, I thought it's appropriate to name this cactus after Paul Hutchison. And it's the only cactus he ever had named after him, actually. So there it is, and it's a very nice plant to grow. It flowers easily in a pot. It has a beautiful flower. So that's one I'd certainly recommend. I also named this plant, which people are again driven by. You know, if this was a sulcuribute or a mammillaria, it would have had 10 names. But because it's a cereus, it doesn't have any at all. So I've described it as Longiserpens erectus, because Longiserpens is actually a snaky one. You know, it grows all over the ground, a bit untidy. This one grows upright, very tidily, and flowers when it's about a foot tall. So it's a very nice plant to grow. Grows around Balsas, very common actually. Lots of people had commented on it, but nobody had really said, well, what's that then? And then one that pretends to be a bramble. This used to be called Borsicactella, tenuis serpens, and you see the plant grows in a thicket. The thin stems, which look just like a Porocactus flagelliformis, but they have a typical Borsicactus flower. They sort of arch over and then they root on the ground again and spread around like that. It's an amazing thing. Uncommon, cold sensitive. There's only 2 Cleistocactus, truly, in Peru. Most of them occur in Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, and so on. There's 2. The one on the left is Morawetziana, said to be the only white-flowered one, but really it's a sort of a pale green. Has interesting downward-pointing flowers. Then on the right, you've got pungens, which includes Brevispina. I mentioned Coreocactus includes Erdisia. Well, here are small Erdisias. They tend to have terminal flowers in either yellow or red, very easy to flower. The stems are a bit boring, but the flowers are quite nice, and they flower consistently, regularly through the summer. Now this little chap here, who is about 4 foot tall, lives in northern, he wears a big hat, presumably because he's not very tall. Now they're made of leather, they're lovely hats actually. But he was very, very proud of his pachanoi, right? His Trichocereus pachanoi, which they plant outside their houses to ward off evil spirits. I mean, some people eat them, of course, for other reasons, but they plant them outside their houses, and you regularly see them. That means then that we don't really know where Pacanor originally came from. But northern Peru, southern Ecuador is a reasonable guess. And there's lots of other plants, like this one here, which is called Charlaensis, which is closely related. And they occur all over, but it's because this plant has been used by man, moved around by man. The Incas moved it around, so we don't really know where it originally came from. Even now in Trichocereus, or Echinopsis, or whatever, there are new species, and in Bradley last year, Paul found this new Trichocereus in the Sandia Valley. Now look how wet that is. That valley is on the east side of Peru, and it's going down into the jungle. And this sort of dense vegetation on rocky patches, we're finding quite a few new things, because people never look for cacti in this sort of environment. So Sandiensis is a pretty plant to grow, and it's got an enormous white flower. So espostos can get quite big. So there's my Indiana Jones impression on the right-hand side. I borrowed Martin Lowry's hat for this picture, just for my neighbour. My neighbour's kids think I'm Indiana Jones. So I thought I'll take them a picture just so that they'll keep believing it. Actually, they get a bit old now. I think they've tweaked the truth. So on the left-hand side, this is Esposto lanata in one of its many forms. Lanata is very widespread, and on the right is Lania nuligera. By the way, the people cut the tops off these to get the wool out the cephalium to stuff their cushions. That's what the locals do. So the plants are often fairly well macheted. The one that grows near Balsas has got naked stems. This is Mirabilis. And a very interesting rib structure. The ribs sacrifice themselves into the cephalium and then multiply split up the back to make up the difference. Quite remarkable. So the cephalium in Espostos goes right through to the central vascular bundle, so it's in a deep groove. Okay, so some Espostos have no hair. I described Bambensis from the same valley as Borsicactus hutchisoni. Now Hutchison, Lau, you name them, they all describe going down this valley and seeing these huge plants. There are millions of these plants in this valley. They grow to 30 feet in height, and nobody bothered to give it a name. So I gave it a name, Utkabambensis, and then very kindly, Myron Kimnack got me access to Paul Hutchison's notes in the Huntington. By the way, it's quite difficult to get to do that. Anyway, he did it, and I was reading through Paul Hutchison's notes ages after I described it, and he'd written in his notes about this plant, and he said, one day I will describe this as Echinopsis, as Espostoa Utkabambensis. So I don't know, I must have read his mind. It's an obvious name, but anyway, it's nice that he thought of it too. On the right-hand side is another one with golden spines and no hair that Ritter described as Espostoa calva, naked. And there's Utkabambensis. Look, you can drive for miles past hillsides of the thing. So I was quite pleased to name it, but why nobody else did it, I don't know. And then we also found this one. Paul and I found this, and Paul described it as Cremnophilus. This is the newest Espostoa. It always has a right angle bend, a sharp bend just below the cephalium. Amazing plant. But it only grows on vertical rocks, so it's extremely difficult to get near, and I've yet to get any seeds, so it's not in culture yet. But there are new ones. I think this must be new. I don't know what this is. This is the plant that attracted our attention when we found Matricana rosiflorus. But it's a beautiful plant, and I just think it probably is different. Now, Trixanthocerius is closely related, nocturnal flowers, 2 species, Blossfeldiorum, bristly bases, very pretty plant, flowers when it's small. And then the other one, which can get very big, Senilis. This plant's 12, 15 feet tall, unusually big. So this has nocturnal flowers, but they're bright pink. Raucerius. Raucerius nearest relative is Espostoa, amazingly. It's nocturnally flower and surely a bat flower, named for Werner Rau. It lives, again, in the Marignan Valley. My hero, Ritter, was very astute to spot that there's a new genus to be described here, Lasiocerius. Now, you don't see these in culture very often. This one is Lasiocerius fulvus, grows on rocks with Matricana, Weberbowery, Flammea, the orange one I showed you yesterday. They grow together. A long way away to the south, the other one, rupicola. This big plant's near the road. Everybody photographs it. It's in Anderson's book everywhere. It has another nocturnal flower. So these two plants look completely different, but Ritter spotted them as being the same genus, and DNA supports his view. So I'm going to finish where it all started. If you look at the phylogeny of these cacti, you'll find that at the base of it is this remarkable plant, Calimanthium. This was another Ritter discovery and a description. He described 2 species, but I think there's probably only one. It's quite a remarkable thing. It has a trunk, and then it has stems that look quite like, well, you know, a Hylocereus or something like that, very few wings. When it flowers, the flower bud starts off like a shoot, and then these funny little petals come out of it. It actually makes a slit, and the little petals sort of drop out of this. So it's like a shoot that's just about becoming a flower. And it's been shown to be basal, you know, to be ancestral to the columnar cacti. So I think we're looking at a piece of history here. Eventually, the plants become extremely large. Sorry. Oh, yeah, here, our bottom left-hand corner. And they get big trunks. And the tree is huge, you know, it's like a proper tree, several meters tall. So Calimanthium is a fascinating plant. It's quite easy to grow, and I've actually managed to flower it in my glass house. So I'd like to thank all the people who've helped me, Paul Huxley and Roy Mottram, and the Peruvian people who've always been marvellous to me on all of these trips. So thanks to them, and I hope they'll welcome me again when I go next time. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.